Welcome back. Now I would like to talk about important bikes. Most of the major manufacturers have a pretty long and illustrious history these days, and inevitably, along the way, there are several brilliant, almost defining motorcycles. These models are always a contentious point though. For example, if you're a Ducati fan, you might say the 916 is the most important bike they ever made. Well, someone else might point out that the 250 Twin of 1959 that set Mike Hailwood on his way to one of the most successful racing careers of all time is the bike. It would be the same with any of them. Say Honda, with a relative youngster quoting the original Fireblade of 1992 as the best bike they ever made. Well, someone who wasn't born yesterday might correct them with a nod in the direction of 1969 CB750. And I might argue it could even be the Honda Cub, which is a scooter admittedly, but it is the best-selling two-wheeler of all time. Regardless, the point is that there's always a lot of bickering if you try and pinpoint a manufacturer's best model, except in the case of Indian motorcycle. Ask any aficionado of the marque and you will almost always get the same answer. It's the Scout. And then they'll add that it was probably the best bike of the time from anyone, and probably the most successful bike of all time, which might be stretching it a bit. I bring this up because when I was at the Top Mountain Museum in Austria a couple of months ago, before it burnt down, obviously, they happened to have a special exhibition on the history of Indian, and gathered there was the best collection of their bikes that I've ever seen in the one place. There was a lot of the firm's models from throughout its past, but most noticeable were the many examples of the Scout, the revered Scout, the model so many have described as the most important Indian ever. I'll show you those in a moment, but first let's set the scene by telling you that Indian Motorcycle is a company that can trace its roots all the way back to the Hendy Manufacturing Company of 1897, and that company made bicycles. One of its brands was called American Indian, which was shortened to Indian. That's where the name comes from. The first motorbike came 120 years ago in 1901, when George Hendy, who'd started the company, wanted something to set the pace for his bicycle races. These weird beasts proved to be quick and reliable, and the first customer version was delivered a year later. In 1903, one of his bikes set a new world speed record of just over 90 k's an hour. 1906 saw the first V-twin race bike, which was put into production in 1907 as the first ever American V-twin. Something, by the way, that still annoys that other American motorcycle manufacturer. In these days, Indians were proper superbikes, as shown in 1911 in the results of a relatively new race that would itself go on to become something of an icon. It was held on the Isle of Man, and the top 3 places were taken by Indian motorcycles. In second place in that race was an Irishman by the name of Charles B. Franklin. He was a mad keen racer and had been for several years by the time of this Isle of Man success, which was followed by a record-breaking ride at Brooklands, the famous British racing circuit with the huge bank corners. And that 1912 record meant he became the first person to ride 300 miles in 300 minutes, which is still going some. Franklin was earmarked by Indian to run their importing business in Dublin. But the First World War was raging in 1915 when England decided to impose a stiff tax on luxury goods to help pay for the war effort. Motorcycles were considered a luxury at that point, and this was enough for Indian to close their depot and instead bring the ambitious Franklin to work on bike design in the United States. The first task he undertook for his new employer was refining and improving the existing 1000cc or 61 cubic inches V-twin Power Plus engine like the one you see in this 1920 model. His racing experience, where he had been working on his own bikes as well as riding them, helped him make the Indian race machines of the time the fastest two-wheelers that money could buy. The bikes were simply too good for the competition, even at one point forcing Harley-Davidson star Albert Burns to jump ship and sign up with Indian just so he could have a chance of winning again. While all this was happening, Franklin was working on a smaller capacity version of that engine. This was 37 cubic inches, or if you prefer, 606 cc's, and it had twin cams and the gearbox bolted to the engine, which in turn meant that it could have a gear-driven primary drive rather than the usual chain drive. That primary drive went through a wet clutch to a 3-speed gearbox, and it proved to be incredibly reliable. To go with a now much smaller engine, he also knocked together a new frame and so created a lightweight bike that debuted in October of 1919, just after the finish of the First World War, and it went on sale to the public the following year. This was the first Indian Scout, a model that would go on to define an entire brand. A short double cradle frame and a weight of just 167 kilos helped it become popular not only with customers, but also racers and stunt riders. If you saw one of the popular Wall of Death shows of the time, the chances were very good that the bikes being used were Indians. Some of those travelling Wall of Death shows still exist, and the ones I've seen are still using those early Indian bikes, so I suppose that's a pretty emphatic endorsement of the package as a whole. 1926 saw the AMA, that's the American racing body, create a class 4 45 cubic inch or 740cc bikes. So, guess what? Franklin bumped the bore and the stroke of the existing motor and gained the extra 25% hike in capacity, and along the way considerably more than a 25% power increase. The next job was to improve on the chassis, and so he increased the rake of the front fork, lowered the seat height and increased the wheelbase, and in the process created the Scout 101. By all accounts, the already well-respected Scout was now even more comfortable, stable and easy to ride, but with the handling package that the experienced rider could exploit even further than before. The bike arrived in the middle of 1928 and was an immediate hit for road riders and for racers. It was only made though until 1931, unfortunately because the Great Depression of 1929 brought Indian to its knees, the company only just being rescued from extinction by the DuPont family, who concentrated on the economics of production and so forced all the very different models to use the same heavy modular frame. Charles Franklin himself became very ill around this time, eventually passing away in late 1932. I'm sure though he would be pleased that the Indian Scout has been revived by the reborn Indian Motorcycle Company, even though it is obviously no longer the choice of bike racers. But I'm certain he would have been delighted by the efforts of a New Zealander by the name of Bert Monroe, whose land speed records breathed some new life into the Scout legend. The records were set on this beauty, which is a replica of the original, and it featured an original 1920 Scout engine that had gradually grown to 950cc in Bert's shed, on the way to eventually nipping past the 200-mile-an-hour mark. There's a great film starring Anthony Hopkins about Monroe's exploits. I highly recommend, if by some freak of nature you haven't seen it, that you make the effort to do so. If you're a biker, guaranteed you'll love it. And I hope you enjoyed this brief look at one of the most famous bike models of all time. I vaguely remember this being a temporary exhibition at the museum, so I'm kind of hoping it had moved on before the January fire. There's a few more amazing, rare, hugely interesting bikes that I pointed my camera at during my 3 or 4 hours at the museum, so whenever I've got a couple of minutes spare in the programme, I'll try and share them with you. It feels like the least I can do now that they're gone forever, turned to ashes. Okay, after the break, the latest news from Fire It Up.